The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today, Examine Economic and Environmental Impacts of Military Bases. My name is Amanda Lambert, the Marketing Event Coordinator at Remy, and I will be your host today. Today's webinar will be presented by Peter Evangelaskas and Jeffrey Dykes. Dr. Evangelaskas is our Vice President in Economics and Consulting at Remy. He manages Remy's team of economists, contributes to economic modeling software development, and leads Remy's consulting practices from our Washington, D.C. office. With over 9 years of economic modeling experience, Jeffrey Dykes, our Remy analyst, will also be joining Peter. He has contributed to model development, policy research, and consulting with regional economic impact analysis. Throughout this webinar today, you may submit questions for them to be answered. The presentation will last for about 1 hour, and the last 10 minutes will be left for your questions. With no further ado, I will hand this webinar over to Peter.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and welcome to everybody. So here we really wanted to look at kind of a pair of really, I think, important issues that are, I believe, not often looked at together, but really should be. And that is the impact of military bases, kind of the economic impact of military bases and their BRAC, Base Realignment and Closure procedures, which we'll talk about, but also the environmental impacts that military bases have, and how environmental mitigation efforts can be incorporated into BRAC, and what effects those might have. So if we can just go to the next slide. Before we jump into the topic in more depth, I just wanted to introduce, we can go back to the introduction slide. There we go. Just as a landing place for us to talk just a little bit about who we are at Remy, for any of you who may not be familiar. So since 1980, so for over 40 years, we've been pioneers in dynamic economic policy modeling at the local, state, and national levels. And really, it's our goal to bring economic rigor to policy-making decisions across a wide variety of policy areas, including what we'll be discussing today, with both military impacts as well as environmental changes. Let's move on to the next slide, and let's talk a little bit more about the military and about BRAC in particular. So, as I mentioned, BRAC stands for Base Realignment and Closure, which is a congressionally authorized process to kind of improve efficiency, increase operational readiness, and really look for the military to find new ways of doing business, updating how they work over time to best serve their needs and the needs of communities in which they operate. So just a little bit of history. There have been a number of military installations around the country closed during past BRAC rounds over the past several decades. And they report combined savings of about $12 billion annually as a result of those closures. And so again, the trying to lower costs, maximize efficiency. As of now, there remain over 420 military installations across all states and U.S. territories, aside from overseas bases. And again, kind of just to drive it home, really the goal of the BRAC process is to improve or maintain military efficiency, improve costs without unduly hurting the affected regional economies. Again, bases spread out across all 50 states and territories. And in some cases, in those communities, the military is a very important part of the local economy. And so care has to be given not only to what the needs of the military are, but what their ripple effects are of their presence, and sometimes their leaving a particular region. We go on to the next slide. And again, just to kind of drive home, and I think really this slide gives you a sense of kind of what we talked about already. Trying to improve efficiency, trying to find new strategies for modernizing how the military does business. I want to highlight, especially on the left side of the screen, looking at our particular application here, honing in on what is the environmental cost of the military, both in financial terms and in environmental terms. So, for example, as we'll talk about, certain measures that the military might look to take, for example, moving to, as we see here, moving to an electrified vehicle fleet, looking to not only reduce fuel costs and emissions at the same time. We see here that's especially driven by the Biden administration's target of 2030 target for greenhouse gas reduction, and the Department of Defense specifically has developed plans on top of that include that electrified vehicle fleet. So why don't we move to the next slide? So let's go here. So of course, a big part of the BRAC process is increasing efficiency and and military readiness. Our goal here is to really understand the economic side of things and the environmental side of things. And so I wanted to land here and discuss some of the different components of those impacts. So first, I'll actually start with the second item here, GDP. And so this is, you can think of that as kind of the national picture of the military's impact on the economy. And so as you'll see, back in 2019, the budget for the Defense Department was, close to $700 billion, or about 3% of U.S. GDP. And it's predicted to increase all the way up to close to $900 billion in 2030, which would, roughly maintain its percentage of U.S. GDP. So it's, within the U.S. economy, which is already, of course, the largest in the world. Just the Department of Defense, kind of the military component of the economy, is its own large economy unto itself. And we can see that represented here. And so, of course, it has a major economic impact nationally. But then turning to kind of the leftmost item here, regional economic development. Again, military bases, really are situated, kind of where they have impact is where, largely where they're situated, which is in, these local economies. They're, of course, hubs of economic activity from, supply chain needs to the great amount of spending that happens, in and around the bases that stimulates economic activity. And so, whether we're looking at, bringing a new base online or closing a base, that has really big implications, especially for these areas that have, really built themselves around the military as the core, almost as kind of industry towns for the military. And so the military becomes not only a hub for national GDP growth, but also for local economic opportunity and growth. And we see that also represented in this third item here, the labor market. And of course, an outgrowth of the great amount of spending that happens are all the job opportunities. Of course, directly, you have the military members themselves, the active duty and other military personnel, and kind of directly associated personnel. But then you have all of the vendors who set up shop in the area because they know that they'll get business from personnel coming in and spending, patronizing their shops and spending money in their establishment, as well as manufacturing, demand for manufacturing to meet supply chain needs for the military. And all of those create opportunities for jobs in these local communities. And that's really kind of the driver and kind of, one of the main stories that we want to look at. On the environmental side, fuel consumption represents a large proportion of the military's carbon footprint. And for that reason, in concert with the guidance from the administration, they're looking to electrify their non-tactical vehicle fleet first. They have a plan in place to kind of develop that strategy, and then are looking to completely replace their fossil fuel vehicles by 2035, because as much of a large economic impact as they have, whichever segment of the economy that you want to look at that has a large economic footprint is always going to have a large environmental footprint, or generally speaking, will at least have a large energy consumption impact, just because, in order to, keep the lights on in offices, in order to power equipment in manufacturing facilities, etc., you need power. The truck transportation, you need, fuel. So there's a lot of just in general, whatever kind of economic activity you're looking at is going to require, the more economic activity you have, generally the more energy consumption that requires. And so, given that the military is such a large part of the economy, it's natural that they would also have a large carbon footprint, especially given the large amounts of fuel that they use and kind of the heavy manufacturing that goes into their supply chain. And so here it makes it even more of a concern for them, not only again for helping their bottom line in terms of saving money on the significant amounts of fuel that they use, but also there are large opportunities to decrease their carbon footprint, by making some of these types of changes. We go to the next slide here. We can talk a little bit more about what those, what the military, impacts, the impact of the military on the environment. So again, there's the fuel consumption represents about 2/3 of the military's carbon footprint, and as I alluded to on the previous slide, they're one of the largest consumers of fossil fuels, period, with about 52 million metric tons of emissions in 2020, which is, dwarfs some, advanced countries. Some smaller advanced economies have less emissions in total than the Department of Defense does. And so, again, just to kind of put a cap on this part of the talk, there are these economic changes that BRAC has in terms of, regional impacts. The military is always looking to improve its bottom line, and in doing so, they're always going to be looking to make changes in how they operate in regional communities, and the changes that they make there will have impacts not only in those regional economies, which is where so many of the employment opportunities come, especially in those kind of industry towns, but in the aggregate, making those types of changes can have very large impacts on both the economy and the environment across the nation. So move forward. So Remy has done a number of BRAC studies over the years in communities all across the country. So here we see, represented, communities from Texas to North Carolina to Maine, etc. And so there's kind of a long tradition of being able to understand what the impacts are on these local communities in terms of the economic impact. And so I'll talk a little bit more briefly about some specific examples of those studies. And then what we'll turn to after that is a little bit of a twist on a traditional BRAC study that really is going to incorporate what are the impacts not only of kind of the BRAC process at a high level, but also the impact of, for example, changes like electrifying the vehicle fleet. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So here we have a couple of examples of somewhat older closures that we participated in looking at the impacts. So one is the Bergstrom Air Force Base in Austin, and that was in 1993 closed and converted into the airport that I have flown into several times over the past couple of years. A lovely airport. And here we see some discussion about what some of the local issues were that we had these kind of low income housing subdivisions that were in the flight path of this kind of municipal airport, and there's this kind of process that took place where the local population, the local economy faced challenges of where this airport was placed, and it required, in this case, kind of redevelopment, including demolition and construction of the airport in order to mitigate some of the these issues with where the base, where the Air Force Base was located and how it operated with respect to its flight paths. And so that was a case where we saw the impact both, of course, direct, of course, there are always going to be the direct impacts, in terms of the economy, but here we also see examples of, other impacts that these types of bases and facilities can have on local communities in terms of the flight paths and how, housing, especially low-income housing, was affected and had to be mitigated. We also looked at impact in Myrtle Beach. And so there, again, this was closed earlier in that same year, 1993. And, here the realignment or redevelopment piece of BRAC really flourished. So here we saw, for example, as the military base, the Air Force base closed, we had, the redevelopment include, a technical college, include parks, recreational facilities, construction of all kinds of community and economic hubs in its place. And we found that kind of the tourism and the building were very successful and were able to offset losses from the base closure. And so there are always challenges, and those included, conflicts over, and this is certainly not unique to the BRAC process, but of course, what exactly the redevelopment plan looks like. That's a perennial challenge with economic development generally, especially in these types of communities. But also, challenges included, environmental cleanup, and again, that goes back to the impact that these military bases have on both local and more national and global environments. So we move to the next slide. And so what I wanted to do now is talk a little bit about the model that we use to run this updated environmentally focused BRAC scenario, and that is our E3+ model. And for those of you who are not familiar with Remy, we have a whole suite of models. Our flagship model is called PI+, which stands for Policy Insight. We also have a tax-focused model, Tax PI, a transportation-focused model called Transight, and a model that looks at socioeconomic impacts called SEI. And then this is our E3+ model, which stands for the energy, environment, and the economy. And so this allows us to basically extend the economic analysis, the economic and demographic analysis that we're able to do in the PI+ model to looking at what are the impacts of changes to energy production, energy prices. For example, the construction of particular types of power generation facilities, the impact of changes in electricity or other fuel costs, but also allows us to look on the output side, not only at economic and demographic impacts, but also now at energy consumption impacts and CO2 emissions impacts. And so that will be a major focus of the simulation that we'll show you shortly. So now why don't we go to the next slide, and I'll just talk briefly about the scenario that we're going to be running. So again, motivated by the 2030 greenhouse gas reduction target and the plan from the DoD to electrify its fleet in several stages. We wanted to look at what that might look like in kind of particular BRAC scenario. So kind of honing down a little bit to a more local level. So here, for example, we have a model of New York State, and so we looked at just to take an example, Fort Drum, what is kind of a kind of standard, slightly modified, but fairly standard BRAC scenario to kind of give us a baseline of, what are the impacts of, these bases on the regional community. And then if we pair that with a shift from, fossil fuel vehicles to EVs, what are the additional effects? And so we'll look at the impact on, on things like jobs and GDP, but also on emissions. And so with that, I'd like to ask Jeff to go ahead and share his screen, and we'll talk a little bit more about how it looks and then what we did. And we can talk through what the results look like.
Sure. I will share my screen just a second.
Excellent. Pop open the model here. Perfect. And so here we'll see, this is the kind of the landing screen, and this is how all of our models look. There's a lot here that I will cannot get into too much, just for especially not to overwhelm folks who may be less familiar with the model. But just kind of the basics. We do have national and regional forecasts that kind of form the kind of business as usual forecasts. You can think of them as kind of business as usual forecasts against which the simulations, kind of the policy changes that we're analyzing are going to be run, and kind of the new outcomes are going to be compared against those business as usual scenarios and forecasts. And all of these forecasts, obviously with the national forecast, the regional forecast, take into account, both national trends, but also, very, down to the county level and sometimes below the county level, detail in terms of industry mix, compensation rates, for, labor compensation, GDP and other more local factors, and those are combined into detailed long-term forecasts. And on top of those, we are able to run simulations based on different policy scenarios that allow us to understand, what is the impact in this case of a BRAC scenario? What is the impact of moving to a more electrified fleet? And so with that, I'd like to show you a couple of simulations that we did. Again, one that will kind of set a baseline for, for what the BRAC will, what a BRAC scenario might look like, kind of traditionally. And then we'll have one that adds in the switch to more electrified vehicle fleet. So why don't we go to that first scenario, Jeff? And so here we have, we've already kind of done the work. Maybe we can just hit the select inputs just for a second to show the kind of landing screen. So here we don't need to go any further than this, Jeff, but just to give folks a sense, we have kind of in the middle there under the variables heading, we have a full list that has hundreds and hundreds of economic and demographic variables that are in all of our models that allow us to introduce different types of policy changes into the analysis. And then on the left side of the screen, we have the E3 plus specific, what we call policy variables that allow us to look at, for example, as you see changes in energy prices, changes in demand, changes in spending on, construction or operations of different types of power generation facilities, so from solar to coal to natural gas, et cetera. And then we were able to look at, a number of other scenarios as well. So let's go to, let's take a look now. Let's go back to the inputs list and look at the scenario that we actually ran here. And so basically what we did here is very simple. We put in 1,000, kind of 1,000 military personnel into New York, as kind of representing an increase in Fort Drum. It's a little bit unusual to put an increase here. Generally, the BRAC process is looking at, realignments or closures, or kind of downsizing. This is really just meant to kind of give us a baseline and a comparison point, and just also kind of a general magnitude for what, kind of the size of the impact. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. So why don't we take a look at the results again of just basically expanding the base by 1,000 military personnel. And we ran this analysis between 2020 and 2030. And so here we see basically, this gives us a nice snapshot of overview of different key economic and demographic impacts. So at the top, you'll see total employment. And so you'll see impacts of, 16, 17, 1,800 new jobs. Again, 1,000 of those are the direct military jobs that were added. But then you see, almost just as many new jobs are created outside of those direct jobs as a result of additional spending in the region in terms of, more personnel, having more labor income to spend, buying food, going to frequenting different businesses, and again also, an expansion of, supply chain, to the extent that spending is occurring in the region, an increase in military supply chain related jobs. And so we also see here, for example, impacts on GDP, in the several hundred million, I should say, dollars in terms of GDP. So some notable expansion of the economic pie. If we go to the E3+ tab, we can look at the impact on energy consumption and CO2 emissions. And so here, first we look at, what is the impact on energy consumption? This is measured in billions of BTUs. And, as you might expect, if we're adding economic activity, that means that, more economic activity means, more need for fuel to keep the lights on, to power equipment, to do, any number of the things that are required to, produce, produce additional economic output that's associated with an expansion of the base. And so here we see, again, across different kind of major sectors. So we have kind of the residential, sector, the commercial and industrial sectors, which see, the largest impacts, and then the transportation sector as well, and then across different fuel types. So we see, large impacts on petroleum and natural gas, and somewhat smaller increases in electricity consumption. We can see those broken out. And so those translate into CO2 emissions. So why don't we move to that table? And across those same breakout of kind of major sectors and across those different types of fuel types, we'll see again here the story goes in that same direction, where an increase in energy consumption means an increase in CO2 emissions. Again, driven mostly by natural gas and by petroleum, but also to some degree by electricity as well. So we see here kind of a very standard picture of a very kind of simple BRAC, where we see military personnel coming in, generating some additional economic activity in the region, and increasing the the carbon footprint as well. So why don't we now go and compare that against the other scenario that we ran, where we added those same 1,000 personnel, but we also paired that with a shift to an electrified vehicle fleet. So here again, that first input is the same. It's just that 1,000 personnel. And then the other variables that you see here are just basically the switch from motor vehicle fuels to, to fossil fuels to an increase in electricity spending. And in general, in order to get the same kind of range, the dollar amount of spending on electricity is less. And so that net fuel savings can go towards spending on other items. So that's why we have that last variable, that federal military government spending variable, where we are able to see a net increase there, as a result of the fuel savings. So why don't we take a look at the impacts? And again, we'll start with the results for the kind of economic impacts. And then we'll turn to the environmental impacts. So as you'll note here, we now see, a larger economic impact. So now we see, on the order of, maybe 700, 800 additional jobs relative to kind of our kind of level setting scenario, our kind of plain vanilla BRAC scenario. And really, the impact that we see comes from a couple of different places. So first of all, we're switching from fossil fuels to electricity, especially in the region that we're looking at, in New York and New England. There's not a lot of, fossil fuel production and refinement. So a lot of that fuel ends up being imported. And so the move to electricity, which is, much more locally produced generally, that's naturally going to have, a positive effect on the local economy, because it depends more on kind of local fuel production essentially than kind of imported fuel production, where those jobs are created in Texas, Louisiana, and other parts of the country primarily. And we also see the impacts just of the ability to again spend the savings on other items. And again, those items are also going to generally be more, kind of, not all regionally focused, but they're going to be able to do a lot more spending that, requires, more local inputs, and more local economic opportunities are opened up as a result. So here we see, as a result of this electrification, we see, some growth in the economic impact. Then the question is, what is the effect on the environmental side of things, the energy side of things? So why don't we go to those results, Jeff? And so again, we'll start with the energy consumption. And we see here overall, again, these are kind of, again, accounting for both the increase in economic activity and the decrease in demand for fossil fuels. We see on net, even accounting for the necessary increase in electricity consumption and the energy consumption associated with just an expanding economy that we see, on net we do see energy consumption fall as a result of the decline in energy consumption associated with especially petroleum, which is, as expected. If you're getting rid of or greatly reducing the amount of fossil fuel that's going into your vehicles, then that's going to be a major source of energy consumption savings. And that's going to translate, if we can go to the emissions, into, again, a decrease in CO2 emissions. If we can go to that, Jeff.
Yep.
And again, we can see again kind of broken out across the different fuel types. We see in total at the very top a decrease in CO2 emissions, where we see certainly an increase in CO2 emissions associated with electricity, but a much larger decrease associated with petroleum. And so there, on net, that's decreasing emissions. And again, that's even accounting for the natural growth in energy consumption and associated emissions, with the fact that we're seeing positive economic impacts and an increase in activity. And so here, this really paints a picture, and this really paints a picture of kind of a win-win-win scenario for some of these proposed changes that the DoD is looking to make. Where certainly local communities can win out with kind of bringing more of the spending that the military is doing. So much of that right now is on fuel that is certainly for some communities more than others really being imported from outside of the region, localizing that spending, freeing up money for maybe other more productive, maybe more local uses in the region. So that has strong economic benefits. But then of course it also again provides savings for the military. So it's a win for them as well. And then of course kind of a win kind of more nationally and globally with a decline in CO2 emissions. And so that's kind of the obviously this is a fairly kind of high level look at what at kind of a BRAC scenario. But this paints a picture of what this might look like in action, where of course there are always some trade-offs, but in a lot of cases there's room for analysis to show us that there are opportunities for these kind of win-win-win scenarios where if you kind of implement these changes in the right way, and certainly depending on where you are in the country, they're going to have more or less beneficial effects. But you can find these opportunities for for kind of everybody to come out ahead. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda, and we can go to any questions that may have come up. We have looks like about 18 minutes or so until the top of the hour. So thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, Peter. That was a fantastic webinar. Just for everybody to know, the slides and the recording will be emailed to you at the same email that you registered for this webinar. And with that, you can ask questions on the questionnaire button, and then just kind of write in what you're asking and then just submit it. And I will ask Peter and Jeff the questions. So with that, I guess I will start with the first one. All right, so the first question is,
It looks like a logistical question. I think you addressed.
yes.
But that's great. Yeah, well, we're happy to just stick around here for a couple of minutes in case there are any other questions. We'd be happy to discuss, and of course, always happy to get a call or an email to discuss further, whether it's this topic in particular or kind of related topics that might be under consideration, in wherever you're working, always happy to discuss help out with projects, see where Remy can fit in to be part of a solution. Maybe we can give it one more minute, Amanda.
Yeah, that sounds good.
And of course, any questions come up afterwards, feel free to pass them along to us.
All right, a question did come in. Does the site include thresholds of federal regulatory standards where changes would exceed or become compliant?
Let's see. Is the site so if I could maybe ask Tom, if you want to clarify what you mean, does the site meaning a particular military base, or what exactly is the question is? So certainly, let's see. Maybe I'll turn to John's question just logistically, and then we can go back to Tom. Tom, if you want to just clarify a little bit. So for the point of contact, I think would that be you, Amanda, and then you could pass questions along to me.
Yes. And I just sent him the email.
Wonderful, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So now I'm seeing Tom's question as well. So if you make changes to bases that might increase emissions that would exceed federal air standards. Yeah, certainly it's the case that any changes that the military makes or any other businesses makes, of course there are regulations, certainly clean air standards that would have to be met regardless. So I think here kind of what we wanted to look at is what would happen if you can take the opportunity to move in a direction where CO2 emissions and potentially other potentially pollution as well fall by implementing these strategies. So certainly the military and other businesses are already constrained by regulation. Really we wanted to look at, what happens, in terms of moving towards these targets that the administration and the DoD has set for, reducing emissions even further. We don't, in the modeling, we don't have those kind of explicitly laid out, but certainly that would be a concern if there are, increases in emissions, in the process of doing this kind of analysis. Of course, you want to certainly be cognizant of any other regulations that would be binding. And I guess the clarification. So our models don't have those kind of regulations built in natively, but they can certainly be accounted for and kind of certainly look at what comes out of the model and compare them against what the standards might constrain them to be. And so certainly you could use the model to do that kind of analysis. But it would be something that would have to be kind of paired with some outside information to bring context to what the model is outputting. We have another question here from, looks like from Earl. I'm sorry, I've kind of usurped you, Amanda. I apologize. Is asking about any analyses that have been done on the impact of the expansion of Fort Meade. I believe so, but I don't quote me on that. Let's double check and make sure that we get back to Earl with the answer on that. We have done a number of them, and I don't have them all off the top of my head. But we can double check and let you know. We'd be happy to share that with you if available. Well, good. I think maybe that that should cover us. Looks like there are no more questions coming in. Again, if there's any more, you can email Amanda, and we can certainly get back to you on any follow-ups.
Yes, and I'm going to add my email so everybody can publicly see it. So if you do have any more questions, you can definitely go ahead and email me. And on that note, Peter, that was a wonderful presentation. Again, thank you so much for presenting this webinar today.
Thank you, Amanda, for coordinating, and thanks everyone for attending and for your questions. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any more questions or would like to discuss anything else with that. So take care for now, and we look forward to seeing you at one of our next events.